Hello everybody and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. As always, Ukraine This Week is your one-stop shop to take stock of all the developments on the political and literal battlefields. Now let's go ahead and review the most important stories straight out of Ukraine. Russia's unrelenting attacks on Ukraine continue to claim civilian lives and cause immense destruction. Let's examine the impact of the latest strikes.
Russian forces attacked a densely populated area in the city of Kharkiv with guided aerial bombs, killing at least 2 people and leaving more than 20 injured.
I heard something flying through the air. I grabbed my child to run away behind the building. I sat down and shielded her. I heard a shattering sound and saw glass splinters everywhere.
A drone attack on the Ukrainian city of Chornomorsk has destroyed a residential building. Port infrastructure in Odessa has also been targeted. The strike hit a civilian vessel.
There were so many drones. It was horrible. It happened at night when people were at home, little children, the elderly, people who were ill. We were sleeping. Who would do something like this?
At least 20 people were injured during a Russian airstrike against the southern city of Kherson. Russia has also struck 12 communities in the Sumy region in 61 separate attacks. A drone was used to stop an explosive device on a passenger bus. The explosion injured 3 civilians. Ukrainian air defenses shot down 18 military drones used in recent attacks across various regions.
Vladimir Zelensky arrived in Croatia this week to participate in the Ukraine Southeast Europe Summit. The Ukrainian president also met with Croatian Prime Minister Andrej Plenković.
The event gathered leaders and foreign ministers from 12 countries in the region, including Kosovo, Moldova and Turkey, to discuss Ukraine's future. The talks centered on achieving peace, Ukraine's path to NATO and EU membership, and post-war reconstruction. The summit followed a joint declaration from early 2024, where participants condemned Russian aggression and expressed support for Kyiv. During his meeting with Prime Minister Plenković, Zelensky discussed extending defense cooperation, rehabilitation programs for wounded Ukrainian soldiers, and potential Croatian involvement in reconstruction efforts.
France will deliver the first Mirage 2000 fighter jets to Ukraine by early 2025, according to the French defense minister.
French President Emmanuel Macron announced in June that France would provide Ukraine with fighter jets designed for multiple combat roles, featuring upgraded targeting systems and advanced defenses against electronic attacks. The first group of Ukrainian pilots has already completed training in France, with further training underway for both pilots and ground crews. The 2005 model features enhanced radar systems and can be fitted with extra fuel tanks, significantly extending its range. French media previously reported that the jets sent to Ukraine would be equipped for striking ground targets. The Mirage will complement Ukraine's current fleet of F-16s, the first of which were delivered by Denmark and the Netherlands. Kyiv is also negotiating the acquisition of more advanced jets, such as the Swedish-made Saab and the Eurofighter Typhoon.
Dutch Defense Minister Ruben Brekelmans recently announced the deployment of the first batch of F-16s to help defend Ukraine against Russian airstrikes. He also confirmed a substantial investment of 400 million euros in drone production, with a portion of funds directed towards Ukrainian manufacturers.
During his visit, the Dutch defense minister discussed Zelensky's so-called victory plan and expressed interest in Ukraine's proposal for NATO membership, which excludes the occupied territories.
The war, of course, is intensifying every day, and Ukraine is setting up more brigades who all need support, who all need military equipment. We need to have this continuous flow of support. That's, of course, a key focus for me as a Minister of Defense.
In addition to the F-16s, Brekelmans mentioned that the Netherlands plans to deliver radar systems and launchers despite being unable to provide a complete Patriot air defense battery. He expressed skepticism about Ukraine receiving guarantees of NATO membership during the upcoming Ramstein meeting on October 12, citing the importance of avoiding direct confrontation between NATO and Russia.
A Ukrainian drone strike set fire to a Russian weapon depot in Bryansk region, reportedly storing missiles, artillery shells, and guided bombs, including ammunition sourced from North Korea. This comes after Seoul's claim that North Korean soldiers are fighting alongside Russian troops in Ukraine.
Ukraine's General Staff spokesperson said the drone attack in the Bryansk border region aimed to cause logistical difficulties for the Russian army, reducing its offensive capabilities. Located near the city of Karachev, the facility was identified as one of Russia's main missile and artillery directorate sites. Large amounts of weapons, including guided aerial bombs, were stored in the open. Local authorities in Bryansk have declared a state of emergency following the detonations.
And now let's go ahead and look at the situation on the Ukrainian front lines. Of course, the Ukrainian front lines remain long. Ukraine still has a presence in the Kursk region of Russia, but the situation along the front lines is not looking good for Ukraine. Let's go ahead and start down in the southern portion of the front lines. Of course, last week we talked about Volodar and that key strategic important city being overrun by Russian forces. This took Russians a long time and a lot of manpower, a lot of mechanized equipment, and of course very, very heavy losses. They have taken Volodar, and it is at a strategic crossroads, which is going to prove to be a problem for the southern portion of the front line for the Ukrainian forces. Now, of course, near the situation near Pokrovsk, Russians continue to advance closer to that strategically important city. It seems that multiple directions Russians are making advances there. Of course, the Alexander Syrsky, the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, has said that up to 50,000 Russian troops have been removed from portions of Ukraine's front line to the Kursk region. However, that is unconfirmed reports, and actually, if we look at what we're seeing over the last week along the front lines, it doesn't seem to be helping Ukraine one way or the other. The Pentagon has also come out and said that Russian casualties have now exceeded 600,000. That is many times more than what is estimated, of course, on the Ukrainian side. Now, down in this section of the front line, it was important to also note that the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, said that the Russians will continue to advance on these flat plains trying to use mechanized advances. So we'll have to see if that does indeed come true. Another key area, the city of New York, has been overrun. Toretsk is house-to-house fighting, reported all this week. Very intense battles taking place there. And of course, the situation in Chasiv Yar. That's something we've been talking about for months now. And Russians making steady but sure progress in advancing on Chasiv Yar. And of course, threatening Konstantinivka and the other strategically important cities there in the Donetsk region. Now, if we move up north, the situation doesn't look all that much better when we look at areas like Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. Now, this map doesn't quite exactly show it, but the Russian forces have advanced all the way to the Oskil River, cutting them off on the left bank entirely to the south of Kupiansk. And of course, they're making advances from the north on the city, which again has been reported that there have been slow advances made, but advances nonetheless. If we look at Vovchansk, the city is also entirely under Russian occupation. It's just the outside of the city where Ukrainian forces, are able to hold off the advancing Russian forces there. So as I mentioned before, General Syrsky saying 50,000 troops have been removed from the front lines in Ukraine to take back the Kursk region in Russia. However, it shows little to none progress as far as Ukrainian forces are concerned this week. Recently, France has been stepping up to the plate in support of Ukraine. Since September, France has trained 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers. About 100 French troops, together with the Polish armed forces, have trained hundreds of Ukrainian troops right here in Poland. The trainings include the use of equipment donated by France, such as the Caesar 155mm 52 caliber self-propelled howitzer and the AMX-10 RC armored fighting vehicle. Logistical support, anti-tank fighting, and sniper training is all part of the package, as well as pilots to fly the Mirage 2000 fighter jets, which will be transferred to Ukraine early next year.
Go! All right!
And now it's time to look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist. And for that, I'm now joined by Oz Chatterjee, TVP World Correspondent in Kyiv. Hello there, Oz. Now, the Ukraine contact group there in Ramstein was postponed. It was supposed to be one of the biggest, most significant meetings since the contact group has been taking place since April of 2022. Because President Biden was supposed to be there, but because of the hurricane, Biden had to cancel. So how has Ukraine had to improvise? Because I know President Zelensky wants to communicate his victory plan to all the allies.
You're quite right. This will have been bitterly disappointing for the Zelensky administration. Zelensky himself very committed to this action plan, this plan of victory plan that he wanted to present to Biden and the European allies at this Ramstein meeting. That obviously couldn't happen because of the hurricane. So Zelensky has been visiting Europe in a bit of a diplomacy blitz over the last few days. He's visited the United Kingdom, France, Germany and Italy. He's met with the leaders of all those countries, as well as the leader, the General Secretary of NATO, Mark Rutte, and the Pope. All of these meetings have been to reinforce the point that Ukraine has a plan for victory, that it needs its allies' support to reach that victory, and that victory will be reached not necessarily in the battlefield, but through forcing Russia to realize that the war cannot continue. Again, I can't comment on how the allies are reacting to this plan from the Zelensky, or how credible they find it. But it's certainly the Zelensky administration's plan to take this victory plan round to its allies for approval, for renewed support ahead of what looks to be some very bitter winter months ahead, and the US general election looming in November.
Right. It seems the time is of the essence, especially now when we look at the situation along the front lines in the east. It's not looking good. And there are lots of reports of criticisms from administration officials saying that the West isn't doing enough right now to support Ukrainian troops who are fighting along those front lines.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, this is the way it's viewed here, certainly. But look, there are other problems. There are problems with mobilization. There are criticisms of Zelensky and his administration, his government, for the Kursk operation while they've been losing slowly territory in the east of the country. So it's not like there isn't points of disagreement here. The other big point of disagreement is the ability to use Western weapons deep inside Russia, long-range cruise missiles that Ukraine is desperately asking its allies for. And Washington is still not budging on that particular point. So look, a lot of ground has been covered between these two allies, but there's still a lot of ground to cover. And the war is going, as you've rightly pointed out, quite badly for Ukraine at the moment in the east of the country. So they'll be looking for some respite, for some good news to come from this diplomacy blitz. That's for certain.
Yeah, definitely. The allies definitely needing to step up right now. Time is of the essence. Oz Chatterjee, thank you for joining us on Ukraine This Week. Russia's economy is nearing collapse due to mounting financial and demographical challenges, according to economist Anders Åslund. Despite Vladimir Putin's claims that sanctions have strengthened the country, Aslund argues that Actually, there have been shaving off around 2 to 3% of Russia's GDP annually.
Regardless of the outcome on the battlefield, Russia will be the biggest loser, Aslund writes, noting that since 2014, the economy has grown by just 1%. In the words of the late U.S. Senator John McCain, the gas station masquerading as a country, Russia has witnessed a collapse of their own military capabilities and must now resort to import deals with North Korea. Mass immigration and bans on Western technology has crippled the economy. Aslund points to hidden inflation as another sign of Russia's economic deterioration. While Russia's central bank reports it to be at 9.1%, 19% interest rate casts doubt into the validity of official reports. Ukrainian intelligence suggests that Russia may sue for peace by the end of 2025 due to economic pressure. But even now, Putin is already running out of soldiers. The United States estimate that 120,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, and more than 1 million healthy Russians fled the country in 2022 alone. Many argue that Putin would not dare to call for another major mobilization. While Western governments have been reticent with granting permission for deep strikes within Putin's territory, the billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets could very well turn the tide.
And now here joining me to discuss is Anders Åslund. He's a professor at Georgetown University, economist and author of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe, and his latest book is Russia's Crony Capitalism. Sir, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Now, I'd like to discuss your recent op-ed for Project Syndicate. In your assessment, how severe do you think the financial, technological, and demographic challenges facing the Russian economy actually are?
All three very severe. And the financial sanctions mean that Russia can not borrow any money abroad from anybody, not even from China. And my argument is that it's running out of reserves by the end of next year, and that is a serious restriction on the Russian military expenditure. The other is that the Western technology sanctions are getting ever tougher. And we know how they functioned very well on the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was extremely backwards when it collapsed. And then the third is demography. Russia has extremely little unemployment, 2.4%. And the Russian government is now offering $60,000 in signing up bonuses for young men in Moscow and St. Petersburg if they join the military. And they are recruiting mercenaries all over the world, India, Nepal, various countries in Africa, to fight against Russia, and now North Koreans. This is not no way to run a war. This looks pretty desperate.
Indeed. We've heard that Russia is trying to not draft its populations from St. Petersburg and Moscow, and therefore we see Africans on the front lines. We see now North Koreans. Does this signal humiliation, somewhat defeat for Russia, and can Russia actually turn to its big population centers in Moscow and St. Petersburg, or is this just political suicide for Vladimir Putin?
Suicide, it might be too strong a word, but it's a serious strain. We saw in 2022 when Putin carried out the mobilization of 300,000 people, that about 1 million people net left Russia. And these were mainly young men with high education. Think of software engineers as typical representatives. And if the Kremlin does it again, it expects that there will be a similar effect. And Russia is now trying to recruit people in dubious fashions all through the developing countries. This is not a credible way forward. And of course, they are using their soldiers as cannon fodder. The US numbers now is 200,000 Russian soldiers killed, 400,000 injured. You can get different numbers, but these are quite representative. This is a massive slaughter that President Putin is undertaking.
It is, and if we look back at the Afghanistan war during the Soviet times, it was what, about 15 to 30,000 casualties in that war that which partially made them end the war in Afghanistan. Why is that not the case here in Ukraine? Why are these losses so significant, and yet nobody's doing anything about it, and the war continues?
Well, you have three major explanations. One is that the people who are being killed are mainly from poor regions of Russia that are not so easily mobilized. And a second reason is that the Russian authorities are paying their soldiers quite a lot, and also when they are being killed. But the third explanation is that Putin's Russia is far more repressive than Brezhnev's or Gorbachev's Soviet Union in the 1980s.
And as far as sanctions go, we hear different assessments of these sanctions, and we've been hearing them ever since they've been put in place. And obviously, we've had several rounds of packages of sanctions against Russia. But in your assessment, do you think these sanctions are really putting the bite on Russia?
Yeah. As you mentioned before, I think that they cut off 2 to 3% of GDP growth each year. Russia's average economic growth since the Western sanctions started in 2014 has been 1% a year. And on top of that, I think that they are now hiding 2 to 3% of inflation and call it real growth instead. So we should no longer believe in the Russian statistics. The point is that the armament sector is really the only thing that is growing in Russia today, and it's mainly state companies, and they are selling to the state. So why not pad the prices a bit, increase them, and then you call it real growth, because the Russian government controls all the statistics.
In terms of economics, what would give Ukraine the edge to see this war through, to bring it to a point where Russia is no longer able to sustain?
If you take the numbers, Ukrainian military expenditure, including the Western support, is about $100 billion a year. Russia's, I would put at $180, $190 billion a year. But Russia has much worse arms, and it pays far more for its soldiers. So it can really not keep up with the Ukrainians. Give the Ukrainians $50 billion more a year, and then Ukraine can win. As your report from Kiev showed, Ukraine needs more resources, and Ukraine now can produce military equipment for $20 billion a year. So it's enough to give Ukraine money so that they can buy arms that their own companies produce, mainly drones. Ukraine today produces twice as many drones as Russia, and much better drones.
We're hearing that from some Western officials, especially in the United States administration, that in fact the Ukrainian industrial military complex needs to be bolstered and given resources so that it can expand. I'd like to ask you about the prospects for the timeline for Russia. How long does it have to wage and win this war?
Well, I was in Kiev 3 weeks ago and listened to, among other people, Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence. And he said that we have now got hold of Russian peace negotiation plans. They want to get the peace negotiations settled by the end of next year, because we are running out of financial reserves. Russia is not as strong as it wants to show. And you mentioned before that Putin claims that sanctions are only making us stronger. At the same time, on every occasion, Russian officials say we must end the sanctions. Please end the sanctions, in obvious contradiction.
Right. We've also heard a lot about sanctions skirters, if you will. We've seen trade volumes boost by, in some cases, 1,000% or more to countries like Kazakhstan. If we couple this together with China, is there more that should be being done along that front to try and clamp down and not allow Russia to skirt the sanctions?
Definitely. There are primarily 3 countries that are functioning as transit countries, and that is China, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates, primarily Dubai. And the US has sanctioned hundreds of trading companies in these countries. In China, the big state banks dare not touch Russia. So it's small companies that are dealing with Russia that is in a dubious fashion that would violate Western sanction. The US in particular really knows how to enforce sanctions. And it's good you mentioned these numbers. Where can you send goods so that it goes to Russia, to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, for example. But then the US clamps down with secondary sanctions, and it ends. A sanctioned company, by and large, ceases to exist if it's a trading company. So it takes some time, and it doesn't happen very fast, but it does happen.
On Saturday, we were supposed to see this meeting of the Ramstein Contact Group. It was supposed to be one of the most important meetings that President Biden was supposed to attend. We know that they've been considering the use of Western-made weapons to be used on long-range strikes inside Russian territory. But we've also heard, I spoke with an administration official or an advisor to President Biden, Ambassador Carpenter, at the Warsaw Security Forum last week. And he said that the United States is looking to Europe to step up as well and also give some proposals at this summit, which has been delayed or postponed for now. But looking at the current situation on the battlefield in the east of Ukraine and the losses that are being incurred and the timeline, the situation, the part of year that we're in, what do you think we're facing in the short term, and what does the West need to do to step up and help Ukraine not lose any more land?
Essentially $50 billion more a year in financing to Ukraine. Ukraine in the last 2 years has each year got about $100 billion in Western support. It needs $150 billion in order to turn the flood. Ideally, I would like to see $200 billion. And as the Polish government rightly says, the $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank assets in the West should be used for financing Ukraine. Take $100 billion for 1 year, and then Russia will be beaten. Ukraine will next year have a capacity of producing arms itself for $30 billion. I was recently in Warsaw, Prague, Estonia, and Sweden, and all these countries are, of course, fully in favor of Ukraine. and are doing whatever they can in order to support the Ukrainian government and military forces. The problems are essentially two: the United States, bizarrely enough, and Germany. France is no longer a problem. They, as you reported earlier, they are now have decided to deliver fighter planes at the beginning of next year, and the countries you wouldn't expect are strongly in favor of Ukraine, such as Portugal and Spain, that have previously not been much involved. So Europe is coming together, with the exception of Germany. And here in Washington, where I live, there's really a terrible confusion. And it's not only Trump who's against aid for Ukraine, it's also the current administration that by and large doesn't know what its goal is in Ukraine. You have a lot of people here who are very afraid of destabilization of Russia for no good reason.
Yes, well, if your calculations are correct, the time is now, more money is needed. Let's see this thing through, or else what are we doing here in the West? We're just inviting more trouble for ourselves. Well, sir, Anders Åslund, economist and author of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe, and his latest book, Russia's Crony Capitalism. Thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine this week. Very much appreciate it. And now we are going to turn our attention to another frequent guest here on Ukraine this week, and that is Mark Toth. I'd like to bring in Mark right now. Hello, Mark. Great to see you again, and thanks for joining us once again on Ukraine this week.
Don, thank you. Great to see you.
Now, I just ended that conversation, of course, on this Ukraine Contact Group Summit that was supposed to take place here on Saturday in Ramstein. However, it's not. It's being postponed because President Biden is tending to the aftermath of the hurricane that has just recently hit Florida, or the two hurricanes, rather. But I'd like to get your thoughts on whether we are doing enough at this point in the war. Mr. Aslund just came up with this report saying that essentially Russia should be exhausted by next year. So if we step up the resources that we throw at this thing and help Ukraine, it can not only bolster the domestic defense industry in Ukraine to build some of these weapon systems that we're apparently reluctant to give to Ukraine. How are we going to do this? Are we doing enough for Ukraine? And how are we going to accomplish this here and now?
Don, it's a perfect question, and I have a lot of respect for Professor Anders Åslund. He's right on. I mean, his assessment of the Russian economy is hitting it right on the head. I think the problem for Ukraine at this point, and not to make a pun or make lightly of a hurricane, is Ukraine finds itself in this perfect storm. Not only was the Ramstein delayed because of the hurricane in Florida, the meeting that should have brought about more military aid and more military green lights, they're also caught up in the political firestorm of what's going on in Washington, as we're under a month now from the election here in the U.S. Also, it's not helping that Viktor Orban is sitting there as the president of the EU at this point in time, stalling things. And so every way that you look, you don't see a collective will on the part of the West. And Professor Aslund was right to say that lack of leadership is coming from Washington. You just don't see a collective will to win. The win can be had. Professor Aslund is absolutely spot on that if we commit fully to Ukraine winning, not just in terms of economic resources, but taking these handcuffs off, letting Ukraine use these deep strike precision weapons to interdict Russian forces, bombers, et cetera, before they ever get to Ukraine, would be a good thing. And then certainly empowering their economy, as you just pointed out, Don, to be able to start to mass produce its own military industrial complex at an even greater scale than it is now would all help. And certainly the agency that's been established in Poland, in your own country, is setting the groundwork for that to happen. But we need to move past this gray area, this perfect storm that we currently find ourselves in the West.
In terms of politics, and if we look at the Biden administration right now, I mean, we know Biden's on his way out. What does he have to lose at this point? Is it if he makes a decision now, this affects Kamala Harris's campaign? What do you think are the restraints for President Biden at this point in time, knowing very well that the situation is indeed very dire?
Don, I think it's twofold. One, you're right. You hit it on the head. It's not wanting to affect anything in the upcoming election, anything that would cause Kamala Harris to have to come out and say, hey, I don't agree with this, or to deal with something that would start in their minds. I don't think this would happen personally, but in their minds would spiral out of control in the battlefields of Ukraine. So I think that's kept the handcuffs on him. Probably a month ago, maybe a little bit longer, my writing partner and I, Colonel John Sweet, he and I wrote an article saying, look, Biden has nothing to lose at this point. His legacy is on the line. And at this point, his legacy in Ukraine is going to be most determinative of his presidency and how historians look at it. And yet he's not willing to go for the win. And yes, Professor Aslund was right to highlight that many in Washington, D.C. are concerned about Russia spiraling out of control. But that's just not going to happen. That's a self-imposed fear. That's Washington believing in a boogeyman that just doesn't exist. And so, from that standpoint, it's frustrating for those of us that can see a pathway to Ukraine winning this war decisively, that Biden can't get past that and put the legacy not only of his own presidency, but frankly, the legacy of Western liberty first and foremost in his mind. We're just not seeing that yet. I think we're seeing these boogeyman fears, and we're seeing the electoral calculus come into play with respect to November.
Right, and we've dealt with this before. I mean, I remember the 90s, everyone was concerned about loose nuclear material or nuclear bombs that could be sold on the black market for a fraction of the cost for a little bit of money. What's different? Is there anything different this time around? Is there something that the West couldn't shore up if indeed Russia does fall into, if it breaks up or it falls into crisis from within?
There isn't. I think there is a perception in the West to try and think of Russia as a military power in terms of where the ultimate power in the Kremlin lies. That's simply not the case. Ever since you go back to the 1950s and Stalin, basically Russia has been an intelligence agency with a military and country attached, as well as an economy attached. And so from that standpoint, nothing's changed. For a long time, that intelligence community was led by the KGB, now known as the FSB, and they're still going to remain the power brokers. And so even if, for some reason, Putin were to topple and to be kicked out of power, I wouldn't expect much to change in Russia. And that includes that FSB power structure, its ability to control the nukes in the country. And so I think a lot of these fears, well, absolutely, you have to take them into account. If you're in the Pentagon or in the CIA, you need to be careful, watchful, mindful of all of that. But I don't think you're going to see any different thing happen here. I think Russia is Russia. At its core, it's a corrupt intel service that's controlled the country now for 75 plus years. And it's going to continue to be that way, whether Putin exists or not, as his president.
President Zelensky, in the absence of this meeting, is making a whirlwind tour around Europe, trying to communicate his four-point peace plan and what that entails to his partners and allies here in Europe, as he was supposed to do so at the contact meeting. But if we back up just a little bit, when President Zelensky was presenting this plan to President Biden back during the United Nations General Assembly at the end of September, one thing that sticks out in my mind is his repetition of the word "a just and lasting peace." If there is any attempt at negotiations, or even if there's any contemplation to have a ceasefire or even cede, I mean, I think this is putting the cart way in front of the horse, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Even to cede land for Ukraine to achieve peace, this just and lasting peace is absolutely critical. Now, the conversation with NATO, is it a possibility? Is this something that we could entertain, that in order to stop this war and stop this war forever, Ukraine would have to join NATO?
Dan, you hit it brilliantly on the head. I mean, what this is all about is how you deter Russia from coming back for a third try at Ukraine. I think anyone that's sitting back, and I suspect you share my assessment of this, thinking that Putin is interested in a long-term peace that does not result in him getting absolutely everything that he wants in Ukraine, is just us snowing ourselves, playing games. Putin, one way or the other, ultimately will keep trying to get everything in Ukraine, and that includes toppling President Zelensky, his cabinet, and democracy in Kiev. The only way that you're going to stop that in the long run is for Ukraine to become part of NATO. It's just such an obvious step that needs to be taken. And we can talk about how to win on the battlefield, which is important. And there's certainly a lot more things that the West could be doing capabilities-wise. But ultimately, strategically, at a geopolitical level around the globe, what we really need to be doing is advocating for Ukraine to become part of NATO, and to become part of NATO as fast as possible. It's the obvious step to put an end to Putin's machinations that we're seeing, in Ukraine this time. Any kind of ceding of territory is just going to be fool's gold. You may think it gets you to a peace settlement, and it may for a while, but just like in 2014, that didn't work, and he came back in 2022. I think if the West is foolish enough to do that, if Ukraine does not become part of NATO and becomes under the umbrella of the Article 5, and then Putin's going to come back, or his successor, in 5, 6, 7 years as well.
Well, Mark, since you mentioned it, I'm going to pick your brain on the capabilities. In your assessment, in your opinion, what do you think the capabilities will be best suited for Ukraine to receive now that would actually make a very big difference in the short term?
Dan, essentially, Ukraine has to be fully empowered to fight a combined arms warfare type battle strategy. And they're just not there yet because they don't have these deep strike precision weapons. They don't have enough air power. They don't have enough air defense assets. And we see these piecemealing. And it's good that they're coming, but they're not coming in any kind of collective way that should be coming through NATO. So, for instance, you've got the French that are offering the latest variants of the Dassault Mirage, sorry, I had a mind break there, the 2005-F5, which is a capable fighter aircraft. But it's, for instance, it's an air-to-air asset, a platform, if you will. It needs ground capabilities as well, air-to-ground capabilities. And you can do that. It can be converted into that. Scout missiles could be fired from it. Hammer missiles could be fired from it. Those are rocket-assisted guided bombs and stuff that have a range of 45 miles. So those are those capabilities that they're starting to get to the battlefield, but that's still not going to happen by the current estimates from the French government itself until the first quarter of 2025. And we're still sitting here in October of 2024. So it's a capability that they've needed. They certainly, as you can see, just from the bombing of Kiev and the Ukrainian cities around, whether it's Odessa, Lviv, etc., they need more air defense assets, not only to protect those cities, but to push those air assets up into the areas of Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, all along that axis in the Donbass, where unfortunately Russia still has air superiority on the edges of the battlefield, and that's playing to Ukraine's disadvantage. So there's just so many different capable areas that are still needed that there really is nothing more for Ramstein to be discussing. It really should come down to a question of implementing all of this, but we're not there yet. And so for those of us that write about this, watch this day in and day out, it's just maddening. There shouldn't be a debate now. This war is going to be reaching its basic third year come February 2025, and there's no need to debate. We know how Russia can lose. They can't create a modern, sophisticated army in terms of modern warfare on their own. They basically are stuck in this mass kind of World War I-like situation. As Professor Aslund was noting, in the previous segment, they're having to look to India, to other countries, to come up with infantrymen just to throw into that meat grinder that is the Donbass. They're not going to train these men into a highly mobilized army. They're basically a fixed position type army, and that's not going to change. Ukraine can change that equation through mobility, through being able to fight a combined arms warfare type thing. But the West has to get off of its derriere. I'll be polite, we're on TV. But it has to get off its derriere and give Ukraine all of these capabilities, air power, air defense systems, deep precision strike weapons and the like, more training of its brigades, which is happening as well. There's a new brigade, notably called the Anne de Kiev Brigade, which is named after a Kiev princess who became the queen of France in 1051, I believe. All those kind of things need to be coming together. They're just not coming together fast enough, and the time for talking about them has come to an end. Just get it done.
Exactly. Well, I feel like we fumbled the ball on the 10, and, well, looks like the other team's got it, so we better chase them down and get that ball back so that we can get the win. Mark Toth, as always, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thank you for having me.
And that's all for this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the latest events from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Goodbye.